Thank you all for joining today's office hours. My name is Sam Becker. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Insane Cyber. In today's OT office hours, we are going to be deep diving into offensive assessments and, finding which one is the right start for you. So this session or this series is an opportunity for us to give you some education on an OT topic, and then allow you to interact with our team and ask questions. So typically our team will go through a brief presentation with some do's and don'ts and education. And then if you want to send questions to me through the Q&A function in Zoom, feel free to do that. And then we will answer those towards the end here. Um, so for those that don't know, Insane Cyber is a products and services provider. On the product side, we do network monitoring using automation, and we can scan host and network data, batch and streaming, looking for anomalies and helping you respond to incidents quickly. And then we also have services on the OT cybersecurity side, where we can go in and act as an extension of your team. And then today I'm joined by Markus, our Director of Managed and Professional Services, and Marissa, who is a Senior Cybersecurity Analyst on our team. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them. And like I said, if there's any questions that come up during the presentation, please feel free to send them through the Q&A, and we will answer them after the presentation.
Thanks, Sam. So yeah, let's just get into it. So offensive assessments at large. An organization deciding that they're ready for an active assessment of their OT environment is a really big step in a cybersecurity journey, and they're very crucial for a comprehensive security strategy. Also, a lot of governing bodies such as NERC-CIP are actually starting to require certain testing. And it's important to know what differences are between the different options that are available. And we'll kind of break those down. So offensive assessment options that are available are things like red team assessments, which are focused on identifying and exploiting any vulnerabilities or misconfigurations in the environment, but also focused on evasion. Whereas the next one is pen testing. It's also very similar, emulating an adversary in your environment, but not so much focused on evasion. I would actually say it's more so focused on collaboration. So bringing in the organization's security team and having a conversation as the engagement progresses is really important difference there between penetration tests and red team assessments. The next one is device penetration tests. This is a quite mature and niche type of engagement. This can be things like literally testing a smart meter, or things like an application, a vendor application. And this can be whether an organization is planning on implementing these things into their environment, or they are implemented into the environment, so they can get an understanding of things like the attack surface that is available for things like hardware or vendor applications. Lastly is vulnerability assessments. These are a bit softer of a type of engagement focused on identifying vulnerabilities and weaknesses and misconfigurations in the environment. So we're going to get into a little bit of the differences, but specifically we want to focus today on pen tests and vulnerability assessments. This is because they are the most common in ICS, and I would argue the most recommended. As I said, device penetration tests are a little bit more niche, but when we look at a red team assessment that's focused on evasion and not so heavy on collaboration, pen tests kind of shine here, where it's really about the conversation that's happening as this type of active assessment is going on. Next slide, please. So I pulled this slide before we get into the differences. I pulled this slide from the SANS, the State of OT and ICS Cybersecurity Survey of 2024 that was presented by Jason Christopher in early October. I thought this was really great to talk about the percentage of organizations that are performing annual ICS and OT security assessments. So as you can see in this graph, in 2024, it's trending at about 75% of organizations that are actively participating in OT security assessments. Which he made a really great point to say, if your organization is not participating in these currently, they're in the minority, and that is something that should be a goal and should be working towards, to do some sort of OT security assessment for your organization. Next slide. And I also took this slide from the SANS survey of OT and security. It's the types of ICS and OT assessments that were performed over the past few years. I thought this was really great too. The highest percentage that was seen is paper-based vulnerability assessments. So that's things like network architecture reviews and configuration management reviews. But he specifically highlighted the desire to increase active vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. Whether that is in a lab or a production environment, that's something that he really wanted to see more of in this space. Marcus, do you have any thoughts on like why that would be and what the benefits are?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is driven by regulation. When you look at this survey, a lot of the participants are fall under NERC-CIP. NERC-CIP requires paper and active at high impact sites. So a lot is driven by regulation of why we see the higher numbers on some of that stuff. I do really think that moving maturity-wise as a community, moving towards active type engagements, penetration tests, red team, purple team, blue team type stuff, it does have a huge benefit. You're going to see a lot more things, and you're going to be able to validate a lot more. So as in a paper assessment, and we do a lot of paper assessments, we're looking at, hey, the network config, maybe that firewall has, allows more ports than it should for like an OS PI historian, for example. Then, a pen test can go in and you can go, here is exactly how an adversary would exploit that. Maybe they're taking the PI admin account, the service account over, maybe they're, doing things like that. Like all those things can happen. So yeah, I definitely think in organizations where we've done pen tests, we see a huge benefit, and also vulnerability assessments, huge benefit to kind of make those things that you find in a paper assessment reality.
Yeah, I love to see it. So now I'll start breaking down kind of the differences between vulnerability assessments and pen tests. If an organization hasn't ever done any type of active offensive assessment before, vulnerability assessments are really a great place to start. The purpose is to identify and evaluate the vulnerabilities that are in a network and its systems, and they usually involve these automated tools that are going to scan for vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Vulnerability assessments in particular have specific focus areas like network, domain, and host enumeration. So for network enumeration, that's looking at the network configurations in the environment. Domain enumeration, similar, it's used for analyzing the domain configurations of the users and groups in the environment. And then host enumeration, which is used to identify vulnerabilities directly on a host and their security configurations. At the end of a vulnerability assessment, an organization should absolutely expect to receive a report that's going to talk about any vulnerabilities that they found, their criticality, and recommendations for remediation. And because they are not so invasive, they don't have any active exploitation, they can be conducted pretty regularly, and especially when there are any changes in the environment that an organization may want to test. So keys to a successful vulnerability assessment. This is a very important slide for me. I can't tell you the number of times that I've gone on site for a vulnerability assessment, and oftentimes the first day or day and a half is thrown to the wind because an organization doesn't have things like the proper access for the team and key components like that that will really make an engagement successful. So to break those down, things that a team is going to need is network diagrams or several of the in-scope environment and its assets. Firewall rules are also really important, so they can perform things like firewall rule analysis and report on anything there. Asset inventory, this should include both the hardware and software of the assets in the environment that you're wanting tested, and also things such as IP addresses, host names, make and models of assets, and maybe any domain information if that's applicable. And then one that I also found quite helpful is a short purpose statement of the assets, so that if a vulnerability is found, there can be a discussion on what the criticality of it is in an organization's environment. So I found that just putting a little purpose statement of what the asset is responsible for can be really helpful. Next, a sample set of in-scope systems. Vulnerability assessments honestly have quite a fast turnaround. I'd say they're right around 3 days. They can extend to 5 if that's the ask, but it's really important to gather a sample set of the in-scope systems that you want to tested that is representative of your environment. Because it's so short and fast, you can't test every single asset that you have. So really making sure that you have a proper representation of what your environment looks like for the vulnerability assessment is really key. Next, access, which I touched on, really important for a team to come on site, have all the access they need, whether that is user accounts or even things like network access if they're connecting right into the network. Having all of that prepared for the team is really important. And subject matter experts being present for discussion and troubleshooting. This goes along with access, is that if a team comes on site and they don't have the proper access, the subject matter experts should be there and be available so that they can troubleshoot that with the team and really get the ball rolling as soon as possible. And lastly, rules of engagement. Marcus, I'll pass that to you if you want to talk a little bit about the importance of that and maybe anything else that I missed.
Yeah, no, rules engagement, I think, is one of the biggest things, especially dealing in these industrial environments. With a vulnerability assessment, we do use tools. It's not blanket scanning. We're not throwing like a Nessus scanner into an environment and just running it across the board. That's dangerous. The rules of engagement really drive that. It's about a conversation about safety most of the time. We want to have a good understanding of what we're allowed to do given an asset, and that's a cooperative conversation a lot of times. For example, I was on a vulnerability assessment, manufacturing, durable goods manufacturing, and there were critical systems, and we came across, a CNC machine that wasn't supposed to be where it was. It was in our scope. It was, our rules of engagement said this range where we can do this type of probing, this type of enumeration, and we came across this device, and we had clear, defined rules of engagement, like, hey, if we come across these types of devices, these are, a little more dangerous from people are working around them. And so we had an escalation path. We had a, hey, full stop, anybody can call a safety stop. And then we worked with the customer to make sure that, we excluded that. We actually ended up doing some enumeration manually. So a lot of times, you get to the point where like, hey, this industrial device, I can't enumerate it safely using a tool. I'm going to do a manual process on it. A little more work, but it was a good outcome, I think, at the end. And that's what the rules of engagement are really there for. They're setting how you operate in those environments.
Yeah, I'll also make a point for a time that I actually didn't have one of these for a vulnerability assessment. I went on site and we tried to plug into the network and we didn't have access. So we couldn't test the assets that they wanted us to. The thing that made this successful was that at this one table, they had maybe 9 different people from all different teams there all week to help us during this assessment. So when we plugged in and we didn't have access, their network guy was right there to say, oh, okay, let me help you troubleshoot this. Let's figure it out. And to continue on for that vulnerability assessment, if we came across an asset and a vulnerability on it, we'd have somebody who was in charge of that asset, in charge of that team, in charge of that domain there to have conversations with us to like determine the criticality of certain vulnerabilities and get an understanding of the environment. So you may not have all of these things, but trying to get as many as you can also still lead to a really successful engagement. So pen tests, bit different from vulnerability assessments. They take it one step further and also serve a slightly different purpose. They're definitely more suitable for mature organizations that really have a strong grip on their security posture and understanding of their OT environment. Pen tests simulate real-world attacks to identify and exploit any vulnerabilities and also prove or disprove security assumptions. They often involve the assessment team manually testing and exploiting the environment, leveraging techniques similar to those by adversaries and threat groups. And it's important to note that there are different kinds of penetration tests. There are white box penetration tests that involve a high level of sharing between the organization and the assessment team. There's a gray box penetration test That's a more moderate level of information sharing between the organization and the assessment team. And then there's black box, which is little to no information sharing between the teams. So for operational environments, gray box or white box assessments are recommended. This is due to the sensitivity of industrial control systems. It can be really, really dangerous to have a pen testing team come and conduct a pen test in an OT environment where they aren't aware of the devices that they may come in contact with. And it's kind of that age-old story that I'm sure people have heard many times, is simple testing activities like port scanning can knock over fragile and legacy systems that are really critical to industrial processes. So information sharing, really, really important in OT environments. Pen tests typically involve the same focus areas as vulnerability assessments, like host network and domain enumeration. But the identified vulnerabilities are actively exploited. So as the testers move through the kill chain, they are exploiting things to continue their progress. They typically include the tactics that are outlined in the MITRE ATT&CK ICS frame or ICS matrix that I have listed here, like initial access and privilege escalation and lateral movement. It's important to note here, though, that the MITRE ATT&CK framework also includes things like inhibit response function, impair process control, and impact. And it's recommended that these are not acted upon in industrial environments. If a team believes that they can, say, convey impact, I would just recommend that the team justify why they think that that is, such as all the preconditions for the specific attack exist in this environment. So just so you know, this is definitely a potential, but don't necessarily prove that out. That could be in a lab environment maybe, and the team is given a green light. You can kind of get into these inhibit response function, impair process control tactics, but for the majority of penetration tests, don't stay away from these. Just justify that you can do them, and that can be in the report. At the end of a penetration test, same thing, an organization should receive a report that talks about the vulnerabilities that existed and how they were exploited, the impact of those, and recommendations for mitigation. Also, step-by-step attack timelines can be really helpful for the report, because you never know who your audience is going to be. They might not be as technical, they might not be familiar with the environment. So having almost like a visual representation of an attack timeline is really helpful for penetration tests, so that the audience can really get an understanding of what happened. Also, just one quick note, due to how involved pen tests are, they don't have to happen as regularly. So maybe just annually you're going to have a pen test, or after significant changes in the environment. Similar to vulnerability assessments is keys to a successful pen test. This can really be dependent on what the ask of the organization is, but typical things that should be expected are network diagrams, asset inventories, notation of critical assets, in-scope and out-of-scope assets, really, really important for pen tests. SMEs available for discussion addressing roadblocks. This is also a little bit different from vulnerability assessments. So let's say an organization wanted a pen test that the goal was to pivot from IT to OT or IT to the DMZ. And within a responsible time frame, let's say like 3 days, they couldn't achieve that objective and it was coming to close, the pen test was going to end soon. Oftentimes, what I have done in the past is go to my point of contact and say, hey, we weren't able to achieve this objective. That's a security win. That's awesome. Do you want us to continue testing these, like testing in the DMZ, even though we didn't get there? Just so that you can know what the attack surface still looks like in that environment. And oftentimes they'll say, yeah, we would really like to see that. And so having a SME available for that discussion, and also saying, okay, you're going to need this specific access, let me set that up for you. So having these people who can work with you during the engagement is really important. And then rules of engagement here as well. Marcus, anything to add on successful pen tests?
Yeah, no, I think the biggest thing is understanding what you want that target to be, that objective. It is really more the way I kind of think about pen tests is like you've got a hypothesis, or you're looking at an attack that's, that you see in the industry, and kind of, trying to see if that fits into your environment. Especially once you move towards the ICS devices, things become, it's usually the exploitation of, hey, I'm going to exploit a DMZ, or I'm going to exploit an engineering server, or one of my, operator workstations. When we start moving towards those industrial devices, it can be very challenging, but the exploitations themselves get a lot easier because there isn't a lot of times as much security involved in those devices. There's a lot of native functionality. You do have to be very careful. At that point, we're usually talking about lab devices. Actually, every case I've worked on a pen test, it's always been lab devices once we get to that level. And yet again, just rules of engagement. It's, making very clear what you're allowed to do, what systems you're allowed to do it on. Yeah.
I also thought about this just now while I was talking, which absolutely should be a bullet point on here, is understanding your goals and knowing what your goals are. Oftentimes, when I had pen tests come across, organizations may not even know what goals they want to achieve. They don't know what they want tested. And so at that point, if they're coming to somebody for a penetration test, that should be on both teams to have conversations about, okay, well, what would actually be most beneficial, and what's in your environment that maybe you want tested, and making sure that the goals are really clear so that it can be successful. Here, lastly, we're just going to compare the two: vulnerability assessments versus penetration tests. So vulnerability assessments, they're more focused on identifying vulnerabilities and misconfigurations and weaknesses rather than exploiting. Whereas pen tests really take it that one step further, where they're going to try to identify all of those things, but then also exploit them so they can continue through the kill chain. Vulnerability assessments are more focused on automated scanning, so using tools that are going to scan for certain vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, whereas pen tests are an active assessment. It can be very skill set based, focused on attaining a certain goal. Vulnerability assessments are really only going to report on weaknesses and misconfigurations of vulnerabilities that are present, whereas a pen test is going to prove out an attack path that exploits those to obtain a certain goal. Both, however, will evaluate network domain and host artifacts most often. They both require RFI and personnel in the organization to be involved, and they both should provide recommendations for strengthening your environment. So in the OT space, these are both really important and really beneficial kinds of engagements that you can bring on to your security program. Marcus, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of times we get folks that want to do a pen test, and they're not very far in the maturity, on their maturity or on their kind of path within OT cybersecurity. And they want that pen test because it's that, it's that cool thing to, hey, we got a red team in, we did a pen test. We find a lot of times that a vulnerability assessment is a better first engagement on a red team type engagement, just because you're able to get a much wider view. A lot of times pen tests, not always, we've run pen tests that are, very broad, but most of the time it is that target on objective, hey, I'm going specifically this path, where a vulnerability assessment may find multiple paths or multiple ways to exploit an environment. And that's really, we see a lot more benefits sometimes for organizations that don't have, haven't done things in the past. It's kind of that maturity roadmap of, hey, I'm going to do a paper assessment. I'm going to do a cybersecurity assessment, or risk-based, or, that type of assessment. Next would be that vulnerability. And then finally, that pen test is kind of the journey that we see be most successful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. That was great information. We've got a couple questions in the chat that I'll send through to you guys. So the first question is, are these activities restricted to just the SCADA environment, or do you see them also spanning to the control environments as well?
I would say more often than not, we're staying in level 3 of the Purdue model for penetration tests. That's kind of where it's safe to do these kinds of activities, but they can absolutely span to the SCADA environment and control environments. Those typically should be set up as their own objectives, their own tests. I believe if you're trying to cram those all in one engagement, something dangerous could happen. It's not going to be as informed as it should be, but they can certainly span these different levels. It's just make sure that the team is informed, make sure it's really a specific, clear objective, and make sure you have all those keys to be successful and be safe.
Yeah, and I think when you get to those lower levels too, I would say doing them at the right times. If you have a plant shutdown that's scheduled, doing some of those activities during that time, clear with production, make sure it's on schedule and everything like that. But the lower down you get, as we kind of mentioned, there's more risk associated with it. And some of that functionality of devices, like the classic example people always talk about is that PLC is going to accept Modbus from anything, most likely. Like we can validate that hey, there's a remote code execution possibly for that PLC, or the master list is set up a certain way, we can spoof that. There's things we can do when we get to those levels, but it's usually less impactful. Not to say you shouldn't do them, just got to be more careful on how you execute those.
Definitely.
Great. There is just a comment that I think, Marcus, I'll pose this to you. There's a comment about the importance of passive and safe vulnerability assessments versus traditional vulnerability scanning assessment. Do you have kind of comments on that?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier with like you don't want to just drop an S. Like if you're doing this in a corporate environment, most people are using some sort of scanner, Qualys, Nessus. There's a whole bunch, and you know doing that against a Windows box is pretty low risk. It's never no risk because you're introducing traffic, you're introducing activity into an environment. In an ICS environment, you don't do that type of enumeration. So when we talk about using automated tools, we are using some automated tools, but it is very targeted, and we wouldn't do broad scanning. So for an example, being out at a battery site recently, and the battery site allowed us to do some ping enumeration, some network enumeration. They had they cleared it with their operations. Their operations actually does this all the time, which we thought was interesting. But they had cleared that, and so it was part of their procedure. The plant was also shut down. It was during maintenance, and they were able to validate the system after we left. And so it was actually the last day they validated everything was up. We were on standby during their dispatch in case anything happened. So those type of things is how you do that in those type of environments. The enumeration on a host is usually targeted. We're running different scripts. We're using different applications to kind of do data collection on vulnerability. Yeah, but not just blanket running, a vuln scanner, popping in a Kali box and doing an open vuln scan is not best practice.
Yeah. All right. So Marissa, we've got a question in the chat about when do you recommend a white box pen test versus a gray box? And then as a follow-up to that, how soon after a vulnerability assessment would you recommend doing a pen test?
Sure. So for white box pen test versus gray box pen test, I would say that it's really, you want to look at what your goals are. So if your goals are to be testing security configurations and access controls, a white box pen test is perfectly fine. You're not necessarily interested in things like evasion, which I kind of touched on with red teaming and assessments like that. Whereas with gray box, if your goal is, okay, I'm really interested in bringing in an assessment team who can emulate an adversary in my environment. I don't really want them to know everything that I have available. I want to know what they can find in this specific time frame. That's maybe when you want to kind of lean towards more gray box, where you're still going to have open conversation about what they're finding, what they're seeing, what they would like to test and do. But you're also getting that extra piece of it from the team of, okay, interesting, here's what they found that we didn't give them, which can be really important and insightful. How soon after vulnerability assessment would you recommend a pen test? That's a good question. Marcus, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it needs to be long enough that you fix some of the things, because that's ideally the goal is like, hey, we've identified 30 things during the vulnerability assessment. Do you have mitigations or detections or fixes for things? And then you could do a pen test to test out and validate those.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, we've done combo ones too, where we've done like or we've done a vulnerability assessment, and then during the vulnerability, we built it in where they said, "Hey, we want to prove out a couple things." So,
Mhm.
in this case, one of them was the one I'm thinking of, was compromising the certificate authority. So, we found a vulnerability in the certificate authority on the configuration, and then part of it was exploiting that. They wanted those kind of combined proved out. We found a couple low risk kind of, hey, we can run these pretty quickly and test them out and validate them. So not to say you have to wait, but I would personally say, yeah, give yourself enough time to at least put more security controls and fixes in place.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's a great point, is that if you're having a vulnerability assessment, go ahead and fix what they were able to identify so that you're getting the most out of these active engagements.
Okay. If you can't scan sensitive assets using standard tools, what's your process for manual enumeration?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So in industrial environments, and it's very often that you can't bring in standard or automated tools, you have to use what is available to you. So this is things like living off the land techniques and tactics. And to kind of address what some of that looks like is just using the things that are available to you on that host itself, like the command line interface and file explorer, and just really using what's on the host, manually doing it. It's going to take a little longer for sure, but there is numerous tools that are already available, especially on Windows hosts, that can give you a lot of information that you're looking for anyways, because these tools are automated because they're basically doing everything that you can do manually just a lot faster. So using those same tools and commands that something automated is using, just doing it one by one yourself.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I think another thing on that is you can also leverage some of the industrial products that are in an environment. We see that where we're able to basically fill in some of the blanks on devices within the environment, or network captures, passive network captures will help us do some of that enumeration. Um, and there are things, for example, if I'm in a substation environment, right, and it's SEL, and it's an RTAC, I may dump the RTAC config, and see all the relays that are associated. And then working backwards, I can kind of figure out what vulnerabilities might exist on those devices through configuration checking or through running tests.
Great. This is actually kind of a good segue into another question that's on the list here, which is somebody asked, do you have suggestions for tools to conduct passive and active scanning during engagements? And if so, what is your tool of choice?
Mm. Go ahead, Marcus, you open
Yeah,
it.
so definitely we have our platform that we utilize during engagements. It's not the only tool, but we use it to ingest both active and passive data. So, for example, we'll grab network captures, we'll grab logs, um, and then we'll also grab enumeration. For example, something like seatbelt is really commonly used to kind of get a vulnerability picture of a Windows host. We may run that and then ingest that data into the Valkyrie platform because it allows us to quickly enumerate things and kind of do some of that cross analysis between what we're seeing on a network versus what we're seeing on a host.
So do you have anything to add there?
There is often in the OT space controversy over Nmap. However, there's a really great lecture out there by Justin Searle on scanning highly sensitive networks, which breaks down the safest way to perform scanning in an industrial environment. And that's implementing things like scan delay, first doing IT ports, making sure you're doing them one at a time, making sure it's a TCP scan, not a SYN scan, because you're leaving specific ports or connections half open. So there are absolutely ways to use tools that are very common for things like IT pen tests, but understanding your tool and understanding what it's going to do is really important in the OT environment.
Okay, this leads into another question. We've had several kind of questions and comments about OT environments versus IT environments. And so there's some comments around differentiations between OT and IT. Not every CVE is important to patch for many reasons. There is another question in here about the percentage of activities that are focused on cloud-based assets versus merging across IT, cloud, and OT networks.
I can touch on a little bit the differences between OT and IT here first, is that for OT environments, it's not necessarily, the goal isn't, oh, I've gotten domain administrator and I'm done. The goal is to identify what is the largest impact that I can create in this environment. And so I think that a lot of the misconception for IT pen testers out there is that it is really the same. You're looking at just getting DA or getting admin on a certain box and calling it a day and saying that the environment is pwned, when really it's about understanding the industrial environment, how it's configured, and what impact can you create if you got that, or if you didn't get that, and still what can you do? So those are some really important differences. In terms of cloud, I honestly haven't come across specific cloud asks that often. Marcus, do you want to talk about cloud at all?
Yeah, I've come across it a few times, very, very rare. Most of what we're seeing in cloud today, although there are some control systems that exist in cloud, cloud native control systems, we tend to see it more on the information collection. So, you've got a factory that's running, they've got their local control system MES running, and then they're pushing out all of the data from the devices up into like a performance or maintenance platform that is doing some analysis, maybe predictive maintenance or optimization of that process. We're seeing a lot of that. We can definitely, do a vulnerability assessment or a pen test on the cloud asset. A lot of times, though, we're targeting more from the perspective of does that path of data flow allow me to get any kind of control back, right? So can I get from cloud back into my control environment or into the control environment? A lot of that is changing. There are more and more cloud applications that we see in industrial environments, for better or worse. But there's the business is definitely going that way, and there are things we see. But it is usually that communication path.
Great. And then going into a couple more questions here to wrap up everyone's questions. If you have any more, please send them through the chat. We've still got some time left. So you said that a typical vulnerability assessment timeframe might be 3 to 5 days, but what would be a typical pen test timeframe?
So in my experience, at minimum, 5 days active testing. Pen tests are very involved. They also, depending on the kind, they can be very challenging. And so at minimum, it's been a 5-day period that I have done penetration tests, but I've also done penetration tests that have spanned 2 weeks. And even for device penetration tests, those typically can span a month. So it's really what the ask is, typically 5 days. If it's an organization that has quite a few things that they want tested, then you can separate it up in objectives and maybe span a 2-week time frame. But if it's something like a device pen test, which is really based on researching, testing, even like tearing these things apart, you're looking at probably a month. So.
Okay. And what's the typical team size that would be deployed for either type of assessment?
So it depends on the type of assessment and the environment. We'll deploy anywhere from 3 to 5 folks on these engagements. It's usually, I would say, 2 at a minimum, but most engagements there's 3 folks involved. We also, we've talked a lot about on-site, and within industrial environments, on-site is definitely recommended. Being able to interact with the folks that are in that environment is critical from a safety perspective, but also from a success perspective. Like, we want to make sure that we have open, clear lines of communication. I'm personally not a fan of doing pen tests or vulnerability assessments where like operations doesn't know. That's usually a hard stop for us. We like want to have the conversation of, hey, we need operations involvement and buy-in. And it can be that we don't deploy everybody on site, right? So you may have 1 or 2 folks on site. You may have a team of 3 or 4 folks supporting them on the back end. And there is work ahead of going on site. So it's not, to Marissa's point earlier, she kind of said, 5-day minimum on site. That means active work during those 5 days. That can be 2 or 3 weeks of prep sometimes. And after the fact, there's usually, a back and forth on reports and findings and validating and things like that. So the engagements can span much longer and involve more people than maybe the direct team on site.
What are the factors that are considered when coming up with a risk score for a vulnerability discovered during a pen test?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So one of the things that I like to think about is how many users have access to this device, and how many users are using it. Also, where is it sitting in the industrial process? Is it directly controlling operations? Is it somewhere sitting on the boundary? And yeah, so who has access? Oh, what the device is talking to. So what's the surface area of this device and the attack surface itself? Is it talking to IT and OT? And is it that bridge point? These are all really important things to consider when you find a vulnerability or an exploit, specifically for OT. Marcus, I'm sure you have good stuff to add on that too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you touched on a lot of it, it's not like, hey, we find this exploit. Let's just say we find an exploit and it's something really simple. It maps right to a CVE and it's a 10, right? That's not necessarily going to be a critical finding. We're going to evaluate the impact of that vulnerability, what it would take to exploit it, as Marissa kind of, and who has access, the ability to exploit it, and then what that impact is. I've had conversations where we've done, a vulnerability assessment, came back and said, hey, this is a critical finding, and then we talked to engineering and operations, and they're like, that doesn't do anything. Like, it literally, like, you could compromise that device and it literally can't do anything in the process. And you're like, okay, that's a lower in information all of a sudden. Like, those things, and that's natural. You want that back and forth. You want that kind of, understanding. Some of that comes from the engineering side, understanding the impact of, and working with them to explain, hey, this is what is possible on this device with these vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, so we've got a comment and a question here. It scares an OT engineer to hear that some of the lower level devices will be pen tested. What are some OT devices that are commonly pen tested?
Sure. Well, I will make a point to say that if we're talking about OT devices and specifically in pen testing, there is a line where it stops, right? So oftentimes when I'm testing, if the ask of the organization is DMZ to OT, and I figure out a way to, let's say, get onto an HMI, I'm done. I'm not doing anything else. I'm just validating, hey, this path exists to your HMI. You should know that. You should also know that right away. Don't wait for the pen test to come out or the report to come out. But there is a line there, right? So I'm not going to be continuing to interact with the process, but some of these devices like HMIs are in a specific level or subnet that's in scope, and testing the ability to access them is a really, really common ask. Things like Pi servers, which Marcus mentioned, and yeah, Marcus, am I missing anything?
No, I mean, the ones I've been involved with where we're getting to those industrial devices, that it's not during a device pen test, right? Device pen test is a completely different story. But I've done IT to OT, or engineering server compromise, where we compromised the engineering server. They then wanted us to compromise all the way to PLC level. They had a spare PLC and a workbench, put in a lab, cleared all the way through, validated everything multiple times, and then we sent Modbus commands, UMass commands to it via our C2 channel. That type of a test was what they wanted, kind of to validate all, but that was in a lab environment. PLCs, BMS controllers, our RTUs, we've kind of done the pretty wide range of device types. But it is almost always in that lab, or we're during a shutdown. And it's been made operationally safe, if we're doing that lower level devices. An example of that is, testing against a relay, a protective relay. We would need engineering and operations to basically make it operationally safe, disconnect the control points, and then we can do our thing against it.
Yeah, I would agree. The only time I've tested controllers and those lower level devices is a lab environment, and that was the specific ask. So for your average organization that's having you test, let's say production, let's hope not, there is a line that you should draw where you're like, I'm not going any further, and that's my duty as this penetration tester.
We've got a great question here about considering cyber threat intelligence when you're targeting OT networks as part of a red team engagement or a pen test. Any thoughts on that?
We definitely try to stay up to date on those. I can't remember. It was Volt Typhoon that Microsoft came out with the intelligence briefing on, I think last year or the year before, which had really excellent TTPs in there that we also found we were using that are living off the land techniques. And it is very interesting to kind of pull this threat intelligence that's coming out, compare it to what you do, and see what can I incorporate, and what am I already doing. That's one case where it was very interesting to kind of incorporate threat intelligence into my pen test, as this is a very real adversary, especially for things like the US. Let me get an understanding of what they're doing and maybe even try to apply some of that. That's a really great report if anybody hasn't read it. Marcus, anything there?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, I think Intel is always used. I mean, we're always doing, like, in every engagement we do Intel, and we're trying to apply, what the risks for that organization and what the risks for that, that vertical are. But specifically, yeah, that mapping, I think, is kind of a thing. We have done pen tests where it's, hey, we're gonna emulate this adversary. There's kind of a narrow gap there, though, because adversaries change, adversaries adopt each other's TTPs, and we don't want to necessarily just say, hey, you're protected against this adversary. We want to validate against the widest set of TTPs we can. So that's what we tend to do.
You guys have touched on this a couple of times, and I'm going to kind of combine two questions into one here. But the first part of this question is, what general standards do you adhere to while evaluating these types of environments? And then the second piece to that is, what kind of communication channels need to be established when you're testing an OT environment?
In terms of standards, if we're looking at how I'm interpreting this, is like, let's say I have a finding, and in my recommendations, I'm pointing to a standard that the company says that they align to. That's how I'm interpreting that question. NIST, very popular. NERC-CIP, very popular, however specific to, the electric industry. Those are kind of the most common standards that we come across and align with when we're putting out a report. Yeah, honestly, this varies on preference, whether that be the company or the individual. It's been many times where I'll honestly give them my signal number, and so we can text during the engagement if I need something right away, if I want to tell them something right away. Having signal is really helpful so that you can get the people online that you need to. But for things like maybe a company that is a bit more regulated in how they want communication channels set up, it can be like their own internal, Teams or Slack or however they want to set that up. Email. Marcus.
I think, one thing too, we set up the communication channels, whatever the customer kind of wants. One thing we do stress is escalation paths. So that exists on both sides. Hey, this is, these paths are how we kind of escalate things. And we do want to make sure that the communication is broad enough. We're not fans of having those like secret pen tests, where you get a security team having a pen test a plant. You find out nobody from the plant knows that you're doing it. That's a really bad day. You don't want that. So we want to make sure that, there can be those direct communication channels, but also, very updated, like broad communication. It's pretty much standard for daily status updates to be sent to a large team, weekly wraps, things like that. And they are objectives based. So we'll talk about exactly what, happened that day, what's planned for the next day, which objectives we are, what systems we're on. So we're pretty detailed in providing that.
Awesome. And then we've got one last question that I'll feed through and then we'll wrap. So how often do these activities need prior safety training or a safety equipment before conducting an on-site engagement?
More often than not, we have to do safety briefings as part of being in OT. So that's definitely a part of the process and something that we ask and account for, specifically in things like rail and NERC-CIP. It's required for you to even be there and touch the systems that you're going to touch. So yeah, that's very, very prevalent for us.
Yeah, showing up with the right PPE, that's part of our, project kickoff. But yeah, making sure we have the right PPE, make sure we have the right clearances, safety training, sometimes, doing that ahead of time so the team, or scheduling for it. There's times where showing up at a site, I've known, hey, my team's going to be on site for the first 4 hours and they're sitting in that trailer doing that safety training, going through and understanding how that rail terminal operates. And it's usually very site specific. It's hard to do safety training at a hey, we're going to do electric, even a given utility. One plant may operate, one generation site may operate differently than another one. So we do really take that serious, and we like a culture of safety. That's what we're really used to, kind of working in these industrial environments. And actually, when we don't see it, we internally we have a like, hey, we need to have a conversation with the customer about safety. We ask for that stuff.
Sure. Okay, sorry. I know that we're at the top of the hour and I said one more question, but one really good question just came through in the chat. So rapid fire answers here. How do you deal with the lack of internet connection at the facility? Any mobile network coverage? How do you prepare for that kind of environment?
That's a very funny question. Mobile hotspot has been something, but no, typically, to be honest with you, we're not trying to introduce Wi-Fi connections into the OT environment. So if we are connected to the OT environment, I don't want to have internet access. I'm going to make sure that everything I have and need is on my attack machine. And even if it's not, I'm going to use what's already there. So the only time I really came across needing that was in a rail yard. And so I can just unclip, download the tool that I need, reclip, and everything's good. But other than that, it's not necessarily a priority for me to have internet connectivity.
Okay, great answer. All right, well, thank you so much, both of you, for your time, and thank you to everyone for attending and submitting their questions. Our next OT office hours will be in December, and we'll be covering NERC-CIP and upcoming changes to the NERC-CIP requirements. and diving into that. So feel free to send us any questions that you have for that in advance, or again, it will be like this where you'll be able to submit questions to us. So again, thank you so much for joining. Please feel free to reach out to the team afterwards if you have any questions. You can visit our website or check us out on LinkedIn and send us any questions that you might have. And Marcus and Marissa are available to answer questions after this as well. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.